Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're interested in starting a new website, then get your domain name and web hosting through Bluehost. Bluehost is easy to use, has great customer support, and easily integrates with WordPress, Google Workspace, and numerous other online tools. Plus, if you get your hosting at my link, then you could potentially get your site promoted via this podcast. Get your hosting through Bluehost at placesandprofiles.com/blue. Hi, everyone. On this episode of the Places and Profiles podcast, I spoke with Jill Hedges about Juan and Eva Peron, the legacy of Peronism, and how we still see the influence of Peronism in Argentina. Juan and Eva Peron, of course, are internationally known figures, very prominent, and there's a lot of glitz and glamour, especially attached to the name Eva Peron, in large part because of the Evita musical that was so popular in the West, especially with the movie that starred Madonna in the mid-1990s. The influence of Juan and Eva Peron still looms large over Argentina today, and with this being an important presidential election year for Argentina here in 2023, it seemed like a very fitting time for Jill and I to have this conversation about Juan and Eva Peron and Argentina. I hope you'll enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Jill Hedges about the life and legacy of Juan and Eva Peron and the continuing significance of Peronism in Argentina. Jill is Deputy Director and Senior Analyst for Latin America with Oxford Analytica, and she is the author of Argentina, A Modern History, Evita, The Life of Eva Peron, and Juan Peron, The Life of the People's Colonel. For more information, please check out the show notes page for this episode at placesandprofiles.com/2. Jill, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, I very much appreciate you joining me. Thank you so much for coming on. So I want to start our conversation by focusing on Eva Peron a little more than her husband, Juan Peron. Even though Juan Peron was the one who served as president, Juan Peron was a figure in Argentina for a much longer period of time. But Eva is the probably more prominent figure internationally and probably the more iconic figure. So why is that? Why is she the one who has achieved this sort of level of international immortality and who's more associated with glitz and glamour, even though her husband, Juan, was the one who actually served as president and held power for an extended period of time?
I think there are various reasons. One is unquestionably that she was glamorous. Yeah, I mean, she was a good rags to riches story. She came from poverty. She was beautiful. She was an actress. She was very good at presenting herself. She was very stylish. She was seen as a style icon internationally. She was unusual. I think there were very few women in politics with that sort of high profile at the time, and certainly not glamorous women. You could maybe draw some parallels with Eleanor Roosevelt, who was also a very unconventional first lady, but whereas Eleanor Roosevelt was often criticized for being rather dowdy and not very attractive, Eva was sometimes criticized for being too glamorous and a bit too glitzy. I think there's also, there's no question that she died when she was 33. Early death has a tendency to cement people's popularity in the public mind. If you like, Peron had the misfortune to live until he was 80, so he was a figure that was rather weakened and rather debased by the time he died. She died at the height of her power, at the height of her beauty, at the height of her fame. So that has a way of turning people into enduring celebrities, if you like.
All right, and let's get into her story and her background, and then we'll focus on her husband a little bit later. But Eva very much has this rags to riches story, where she rose from poverty to being ultimately the spiritual leader of the nation. This dominant figure in Argentina whose death was mourned nationally. So how did Eva go from this rural, impoverished background to being this nationally prominent figure at the time of her passing?
Well, it is quite remarkable. I think some of it has to come down to luck. A lot of it comes down to ambition, and a lot of it comes down to the fact that she really was quite exceptional. As you say, she came from a very poor background. She was an illegitimate child. this was very much frowned upon in Argentina, which was really a fairly conservative and socially stratified society. This was seen as being really beyond the pale. When she was little, other children weren't allowed to play with her and her siblings. She was, in a sense, they were almost seen as being sort of virtual prostitutes merely by virtue of the fact that they didn't have a father. And she dreamed of being an actress when she was growing up. This is nothing unusual, either in Argentina or anywhere else. But what is unusual is she actually left her hometown and went to Buenos Aires and managed to become an actress. It's a success story that inspires a lot of people, but I think it also has resonance for a lot of people in Argentina, because people then and now tended to gravitate to Buenos Aires to look for work, whether you were looking for work in a factory or as a servant or as an actor or whatever, that was where you went. And so the cities were full of poor people, of especially poor young women who were looking for jobs and who found it very, very difficult. One of the things that's most discussed about her always is sort of her sexual history and whether she in fact traded sexual favors for work. I don't think there's much question about that. I think that was fairly common across the theatrical community in Argentina and elsewhere, but also it was very common for other working women if they wanted to keep their jobs as maids or in factories or whatever. This was usually part of the equation. So when she became First Lady, this was a very shocking thought for middle class and upper class society. But for working class people, this was the norm. So it was nothing shocking. If anything, the fact that she was able to rise above it and become very successful, I think, is something that made her very popular.
Yeah, and what was it about her, and what were the circumstances under which she was able to rise above it and become so successful and nationally significant? Because as you say, this was pretty typical for working class people to be engaging in these sorts of favors and behaviors. But Ava's the person that we're talking about today, not these other working class women of that time period. So what was it about her, and what were those circumstances?
Some of it was unquestionably luck. Some of it must have been perseverance. A lot of people gave up and decided to go back to the provinces and try to get married and have a normal life. But I think, she herself admitted she was no great talent. So whether she manipulated some of her boyfriends into getting her work, I'm sure that's true. She was manipulated and she manipulated, but she also seems to have had a great ability to make friends and to attract devotion from people. Even in her sort of early years as an actress, there were a lot of people who were willing to give her small parts and who looked out for her. There were actresses who took her in because she couldn't afford to pay rent. I think she was very good at building relationships with people. Now, how she got from there to becoming Evita is a different matter. Again, I think the fact that she met Peron was probably luck as much as anything, but she fitted very well with the image that he was creating as a dynamic political figure who was doing important things for the trade union movement, for labor rights. She fitted into that very well because she didn't have to pretend she was working class. She could speak to that constituency. She had been an actress, so she was good at public speaking. She knew how to do that. She was attractive. She was in some ways just the right person in the right place. But she did a lot with it beyond the strictly symbolic. She believed that she and the government had an obligation to do things for their supporters. She was a very tireless worker. She was very keen, for instance, on setting up a nursing school and training professional nurses, which previously in Argentina, nurses had tended to be nuns, or it was a respectable job for women, but they didn't necessarily have any formal training. She was very keen on training up women to do jobs, whether nursing, teaching, going into politics, which was something they had not done before. She was quite strong on giving people the skills to advance themselves in that way. The downside of this, of course, is that it all really came down to, you had to vote for the party, you had to be loyal to the party. So there was a very strong partisan part of this, but nonetheless, I think she did things especially I think for working women and for the role of women in sort of the public arena in Argentina, which nobody had seen before.
All right, so now that we've looked at Eva's background, let's shift our focus here a little bit and talk about Juan's background. So Juan, we mentioned in the introduction that he was a colonel when I read the titles of your books and the subtitles. So we have that established that he was in the military. But he was also previously married prior to meeting Eva, and he, of course, had his own path to power. So what was Juan's background, and what trajectory, what path did he take from the time of his childhood up until he meets Eva in the 1940s?
Well, his background wasn't much more conventional than hers. His father was the son of a well-known doctor. He was middle class, but he himself was not very successful, and he was a little bit of a wastrel. He had 2 children with a domestic servant who was all or partly of indigenous ancestry. This is something which is extremely unusual for either the military or political classes in Argentina. His parents did eventually marry, so he became semi-legitimate, let's say, but he was always somewhat outside the standard kind of middle-class profile. He went into the army. He studied to become a cadet when he was 15 years old, and even this, at the time, it was quite difficult to get into that because he wasn't considered officer material if he had unmarried parents and if his mother was indigenous. So some of his background was fudged, shall we say, when he got into the military college. But from there, he took this fairly conventional path to career progression and middle class success. He became an army officer. He was highly regarded. He taught military history in the Superior War School. So he was quite a successful figure within the army. For at least the first 15 years or so of his career, I don't think he had an interest in politics. He did have an interest in social issues, in the sense that a lot of conscripts that they took in were very, very poor people who were malnourished, who had very little education, and he was quite keen on teaching conscripts. This is something that carries over into his political career. I think if you look at him as a politician, you have to recognize that he had a long career as a teacher. He liked the teacher-pupil role, and he liked telling people what was what, if you like. He was married for 10 years to a young woman who died of cancer, like Eva. Years later, she died when she was only 30. At that time, as I say, he was a successful but fairly conventional army officer. He was the military attaché in Chile toward the end of his first wife's life and got somewhat involved in espionage while he was there. Then, after she died, he was sent to Italy on assignment, which is where he came face to face with Mussolini and how the structure of fascism in Italy was working at the time. There's been a lot made of his fascist sympathies, supposedly. I think, to be honest, I don't think Peron had any ideology whatsoever. I think he was an opportunist, and he took bits of various kinds of ideology and put them together. But being in Italy in the late 1930s, he saw what at the time looked like a very successful government. Italy was industrializing. It was looking organized, as they used to joke about Mussolini making the trains run on time. But about a third of the Argentine population was made up of poor Italian immigrants who had left because Italy was seen as a very poor country with no sort of chances of progression. So for somebody coming from there to come to Italy in the late 1930s and see what looked like this sort of impressive industrial renaissance, I think had an impact on him, and he saw it as something that might be replicated in Argentina.
Now, what were the circumstances under which he met Eva? I know there's a lot of talk usually about this earthquake in the city of San Juan in 1944 and the benefit concert. So what happened there? How did he meet Eva? And how did his meeting Eva affect his ultimate political ambitions in this transition from being more of a military figure and then being interested and dabbling in politics a little bit to ultimately becoming someone for whom politics dominated so much of his life?
Well, by the time they met, I think he'd already taken that leap into politics. He was already involved in organizing the military coup in 1943, which overthrew a very corrupt and illegitimate government. He was part of a group of youngish officers who had ideas about transforming government. He took over the Secretariat of Labor, and he had made a big splash there. He had implemented a lot of labor legislation, which had been basically lying on the books, but doing nothing for many years. He did a lot to bring in more union organization, paid holidays, paid sick leave, higher wages. Again, all of this, I think, genuinely, partly with an eye to improving the country and improving society, but also improving his own career prospects. So he was already very much on that path by the time he met Eva. And it's worth saying that before he met Eva, also he was showing an interest in women's rights. He had brought people in to work on the issue of women's rights and possibly women's suffrage into the Labor Secretariat while he was there. As you say, he met Eva somewhere around the context of the San Juan earthquake in January 1944. Nobody's ever been able to pin down exactly how it came about, but he took the lead in organizing aid from the government side and also organizing charitable funds involving actors in particular. She was not a big name at the time. She was a moderately well-known radio actress, but she wouldn't have been central to all of this. But one way or another, they met during the course of the San Juan relief efforts, and that was pretty much it for both of them. They pretty much never separated again until she died. I think it was genuinely love at first sight, however much they both may have seen the potential benefits of the relationship. I think, particularly from his point of view, the relationship wasn't entirely beneficial to his career because she wasn't really respectable. She was not somebody that a political figure was supposed to marry. So in some ways, she was, at least in the early stages, she was more of a liability to him. So I think the fact that he stuck with her shows that actually it was a very sincere relationship.
So how do we get from 1944, where he meets Eva, to 1946, where Juan becomes president for the first time? What does that sequence of events look like, and who were some of the people that were so strongly supporting his rise to power? I know you've talked about his interest in labor rights and the working class. There's this notion of the descamisados, the shirtless ones. But what did this progression from meeting Eva, becoming interested in politics, then meeting Eva, the progression from that to becoming president, and the sorts of people in Argentina that really were fueling that rise?
Well, from the time they met in 1944 until he was elected in February 1946, most of that time she was his mistress, actually, and they were living together openly, which was very shocking in Argentina at the time. But they didn't actually marry until October of 1945. he started accumulating government functions. By 1945, he'd been promoted to Minister of Labor. He was also Minister of War. He was also Vice President. He had tremendous support among the trade unions in particular, and tremendous support in some sectors of the military, those that were interested in modernization, in industrialization, who saw a sort of a more dynamic path forward and away from the traditional kind of conservative agricultural oligarchy, which the economy had been based on, really, historically. He also attracted an awful lot of opposition from other social sectors. I think it's fair to say not exclusively a working class movement, because he was very big on creating sort of public sector white collar jobs. So he had a substantial amount of middle class support, but not much support among the economic elites, the traditional elites, and an increasing amount of pushback from some sectors of the military who thought that he was too ambitious and that he was driving a personal agenda rather than an institutional one. This all came to a head in October of 1945 when several military leaders basically gave an ultimatum to the president, General Farrell. Peron had to go. Peron did step down. He was placed under arrest temporarily. And this prompted a huge backlash from his working class supporters, which culminated in the 17th of October 1945, a very famous event in which literally hundreds of thousands of people marched on the center of Buenos Aires and demanded that he be released and returned to power. Nobody had ever seen anything like this before in Argentina. People have tended to claim that Eva was behind the organization of this. I think that's really not true. At the time, she was still just a radio actress and his mistress. She was not really important in the trade union movement at the time. It was really, more than anything, it was a group of prominent trade union leaders who pushed for action. But it's still one of the more astonishing events, I think, because literally hundreds of thousands of people came out peacefully. They marched into the center of Buenos Aires and demanded to have their leader back. And the government capitulated. Peron was brought back. He spoke to them from the balcony of Government House. And in a sense, the rest is history. A week after that, he married Eva finally and launched his candidacy for the 1946 presidential elections.
Well, and then as president, his time is very controversial, sometimes viewed as a dictator or a military strongman, sometimes looked at more for public works and championed the working class. Earlier, you mentioned alleged sympathies towards Mussolini. Sometimes there are comparisons to Francisco Franco's regime in Spain. So how could we view his time as president the first time from 1946 to 1955? And what are some of the characteristics and hallmarks of this time period that make him such a controversial figure even today?
Well, I mean, it was curious because he was accused of being a fascist and also accused of being a communist at the same time. He was actually very wedded to what he thought of as the third position between communism and capitalism, and in which basically, as I say, I think he took bits of various ideologies and various programs that he thought were useful and put them together. I think there isn't a clear distinction, let's say, but early in his presidency from 1946, the country was in a very good economic position. It had come out of the Second World War as a creditor nation. He spent a lot of money very freely on some things that were ill-advised, such as nationalizing everything in sight. But at the same time, a lot of money was spent on on modernization, on industrial capacity, on increasing wages. This was only sustainable up to a point because the intention of increasing both consumption and production only worked to a degree. Production didn't increase enough to meet growing consumption. So you started to have the inflation, which has been chronic up until today. I think it's a mixed record. He tried to move away from the agricultural-based economy to an industrial economy too quickly and with too much state intervention. But at the same time, I think he modernized a lot of sectors. He modernized certainly labor rights, which were largely non-existent before. His government brought in women's suffrage, which, to be honest, it would have happened anyway. It was happening around Latin America at around that time anyway, so it's not particularly striking. But I think on the one hand, he did many things to modernize and to strengthen women's rights and labor rights. But he did have the tendency to tie everything up with loyalty to himself. So the government did a lot of really very positive things, which frankly, a lot of his program was based on the British Labour government's program at the time after the Second World War, the introduction of a public health system and a social welfare network. They weren't massively radical things in the world at large at the time. But everything started to become increasingly dependent on loyalty to Peron and to the party. Having a party card would get you many things, and being in opposition would see you struggle to get jobs, struggle to get access to the many benefits. I think this became worse as time went on. I would say that when he became president in 1946, claims by the opposition that he was a dictator were really untrue. I think he moved increasingly in that direction as he went along. By 1955, when the economy was in increasing disarray, he became more and more authoritarian. He became less and less willing to accept any sort of opposition or criticism. Opposition newspapers were closed. Opposition politicians were jailed. He moved very much towards becoming what his critics accused him of being at the outset, which I think he hadn't been at the time. There is a tendency to associate kind of the golden age of the Peron government with Evita, because she died in 1952, and there's a tendency to suggest that things were good until then and everything went bad from there. I think things were already slipping before that. Certainly the economy was, but it became clearer because she was very divisive. She was loathed by many people, but she was also loved by many people. And once she was removed as sort of the government's main cheerleader and its most humane face in some ways, that I think made a huge symbolic difference to where the government was going.
If you're interested in starting a website, then use Bluehost. I use Bluehost for placesandprofiles.com, and it's great. Their customer support is quick, responsive, and helpful, and it works well with WordPress, WooCommerce, Google Workspace, and countless other online tools. As an added bonus, if you get your domain name or hosting through my Bluehost link, then I will mention your website on the show and link to your website on placesandprofiles.com, as long as your website is not inappropriate and is not significantly opposed to my beliefs and values. Check out Bluehost and get your domain name and hosting today by going to placesandprofiles.com/blue. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/blue. Well, and I want to return to the final years of Evita and her role in Juan Perón's administration here in a moment. But before we do that, another part of Juan's legacy internationally is his government's providing refuge for war criminals. This is probably most famous in the context of Adolf Eichmann and other Nazi war criminals. But what exactly was going on there, and how does that fit into his legacy?
Well, we probably shouldn't forget the number of war criminals who went to the United States and Canada and many other countries as well. I don't think it's a purely Argentine phenomenon. Quite a few went to Argentina. There are many reasons for this. I think one is that there was already a very large German community in Argentina, which facilitated it. Another is that there were unquestionably corrupt officials that were selling passports to war criminals. I think Peron himself didn't care all that much, to be honest. As I said before, I don't think he had any great ideological sympathies one way or another, but he did have an interest in maintaining good relations with the Catholic Church, at least initially. And following the war, the Vatican had an interest in trying to find places for war criminals to go. The Vatican under Pius XII was actually pretty active in trying to get Nazi war criminals into safe third countries, and a number of them did go to Argentina. It's probably worth pointing out here that Argentina also took in huge numbers of refugees from Europe during the war. It had the largest Jewish community in Latin America, and Peron was the first president of Argentina who actively tried to build ties with the Jewish community. So I think, there's a tendency to see him as being a sort of Nazi sympathizer, and I would say that there is every reason to say that, as I say, I think he was probably rather cynical. I don't think he cared too much about Nazi war criminals arriving as long as they didn't bother him too much and might bring some economic benefits. But there's every evidence that his government was not in any sense anti-Semitic, and really quite the contrary. I mean, Argentina was the second country to recognize the state of Israel. It was the first Latin American country to open diplomatic relations with Israel. And so it's like everything else. His record was very mixed. There's no clear pattern to almost any of his ideas where you can say that this is all good or this is all bad. It's like it's a very strange mix of really rather unpleasant things with much more progressive ideas.
Well, and even today, Argentina has the largest Jewish population in Latin America. Buenos Aires has the largest Jewish population of any Latin American city. One of the 10 largest Jewish populations in the world for any city is in Buenos Aires. So we still see a large Jewish community there today. So you're right; it is a very mixed legacy in this area. But before we get back to more recent topics and more of the present day, I want to go back to the final years of Ava's life. You talked earlier about her role in her husband's administration a little bit, but she was also involved in charitable work. She had her foundation, which itself is very controversial. Then she temporarily was going to run for vice president alongside her husband running for president before health problems forced the withdrawal of her candidacy. What does Ava's life and Ava's work during her latter years look like, and what does how exactly does that fit in to this larger story of that particular part of Juan Perón's presidency?
Well, I think she had a phenomenal amount of energy and a phenomenal capacity for organization. Once he became president and he was slightly more removed from day-to-day relations with social movements or trade unions, she took over a lot of that. She became the main interlocutor with the trade unions, but she also established the Women's Peronist Party, which really made a huge effort to train up women for political activity. And as I said before, obviously the salient feature of that was that they had to be Peronists, they had to be loyal to Peron, to Evita, and to the party. But it wasn't a role that women had really played in Argentina before. She set up the nursing school and, as you say, the Eva Peron Foundation, which she regarded as social justice rather than charity. she had no official role within her husband's government. She did all of these things slightly without any kind of institutional controls, which gave rise to questions about where the money was coming from and where it was going. I think it would be fair to say that the Eva Peron Foundation, some of its funding sources were slightly questionable. They got money out of companies in exchange for not being faced with huge tax debts, for example, or in payment of fines for alleged infringements. They got charitable donations thanks to the offer of other benefits, political or personal benefits. But there isn't really any evidence of embezzlement of the funds. They may not have been spent extremely well, but I think they were spent on or intended for. The military government that took over after Peron was overthrown set up a commission to investigate the Eva Peron Foundation, and even they never actually found any evidence of malfeasance. But it spent enormous amounts of money on everything from building social housing to conducting national football tournaments for schools, which enabled them to bring thousands of children together. They would get health checks as well as everything else. It was an enormous motor for social welfare and for demonstrating the profile of the government as a really activist, really committed government that was doing these things for people. As I say, a lot of it was probably not very well spent. Fortunes were spent on working women's hotels in Buenos Aires so that working women would have somewhere decent to live when they came to the capital. Obviously, there weren't enough of them to go around, and they were very lavishly decorated and furnished. And you can question whether this was the best use of funds, but I think it was probably more idealistic than dishonest, let's say. But it gave Eva, as I say, this role as she was regarded as the heart of the government. Really, she was the caring one who was holding up the government's responsibilities in social welfare and social provision. She was also, for that reason, she was a lightning rod for a lot of criticism for the government. But I think once she died, it lost that kind of the human approach of the first lady, who had no public office, and she was simply devoted to her people, to the descamisados, to the workers. In about 1949, she started having symptoms of the uterine cancer that killed her when she was only 33. So this was an incredibly short career, actually. As you say, in 1951, she was put forward as the vice presidential candidate for her husband's second term. I'm not sure that it was ever a very serious prospect because, number one, the military was still an important part of Peron's backing, and the military was 100% opposed to her. They didn't like her personally. They didn't like her background. And they wouldn't really have tolerated a woman potentially becoming commander-in-chief of the armed forces and become president. It was never going to be accepted. And by that time, she was already very ill. And it was, I think, I'm not sure she ever accepted that, but it was quite plain at that point that she really no longer had the health or the stamina to carry on in any sort of role like that. But it was very significant from the point of view that, as I say, this is someone who was very poor, who was illegitimate, and she was a woman, and she was actually put forward as a possible vice presidential candidate, something that was beyond anything that had ever happened before.
All right. So as we mentioned earlier, she dies in her 30s of cancer in 1952. Then ultimately Juan's presidency, Juan's regime is overthrown in 55. He goes into exile. Then he comes back and regains the presidency in the 1970s before dying and having his third wife, Isabel, succeed him and actually become the first female president of Argentina. So what do these years post Evo look like for Juan, where he gets overthrown, goes into exile, comes back, becomes president again, dies, and then his third wife, Isabel, becomes president? What does that chapter of his life and of Argentine history look like?
A rather long and sad postscript that, it would have been better for everybody if it hadn't happened. I mean, for him personally, I think he found it very difficult to get over having been overthrown. He spent a long time drifting from one country to another before he finally ended up in Spain in 1961. And he stayed there until 1973, in spite of the fact that, although, as you said, he was sometimes compared with Franco, in fact, they couldn't stand each other and they only met once, and Franco was really rather unwilling to have him there. But he was there from 1961 to 1973. He spent much of this time scheming to try to get back into power, and he made use of many things, including the fact that the military government that overthrew him was extremely repressive. It banned the Peronist party. It banned any sort of Peronist symbolism. It put many trade union and other Peronist leaders in prison. So it was very strongly resented. And the fact that, the Peronist party was actually proscribed from 1955 until 1973. So this left quite fertile ground for Peron to keep stirring there. He had various so-called delegates because he wasn't allowed to return. He had various delegates who operated the different factions of the party. By this time, you had the trade unions, you had quite a right-wing part of the party, you had the so-called left-wing, the armed insurgent members of the party. He played them all off against each other because he still really wanted to be in power. By the time he actually came back, he was nearly 80 years old. He was in very, very bad health. He was, if not suffering from dementia, he was not too far off it. By that time, the country was in such chaos that he got the largest vote share he had ever received, including from people who had never voted for him before, because they thought that in this disaster, perhaps he was the one person who could come back and unite the country. And alas, that was not the case. I don't know that anybody could have done it, but at that point, he was a very sick old man who had done quite a bit himself to cause the chaos that was prevailing in Argentina. So it was a return in 1973 that brought a lot of optimism and ended up in really dismal failure. His widow, Isabelita, was probably one of the most inept people ever in the whole public office. She had no qualifications whatsoever for the job. It was an impossible situation, and she was overthrown a year and a half later by the military government, which then undertook really the most savage period of repression in Argentine history, which is where we have somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 disappeared. Let's say there's no very precise figure, but the whole experiment of trying to bring Peron back from a very long period of exile to reunite the country was a more dismal failure as I can remember.
Well, and his third wife, his widow, Isabel, she's still alive, 92, living in exile in Spain. So her legacy in Argentina, it seems to be even one such that she can't return to the country. So what is the situation? I don't think she ever wanted to. I think she was quite happy while they were living in Madrid, and she could be sort of a socialite and play cards with her friends. I'm not sure
how much she really wanted to be president. I think she was probably manipulated. She probably liked the idea in principle, but she was incredibly ill qualified for it. But after she was overthrown, she was actually imprisoned for a while. And in 1980, when she was released, she went back to Spain. I don't think it's that she couldn't go back to Argentina. I don't think she ever wanted to. I think she was much happier in Madrid, and she went back there and she stayed there. She's been back to Argentina a couple of times, but she never looked like she had any desire to be there.
Got it. All right. Well, I know our time is about to run out, so a couple of more questions before we wrap up and conclude this conversation. But after Peron dies, then Isabel briefly becomes president. She's overthrown. You mentioned this period of disappearance and suppression, often called the Dirty Wars, where Peronism was in a lot of ways suppressed, and Peronists were oppressed during that time. But then after democracy returns in Argentina in 1983, we see this modern form of Peronism take hold and have really long-lasting effects. So what has the legacy of Peronism been, and how influential has it been in Argentine politics during this time? Because it's still a very relevant political movement in Argentina today, and has been that way for pretty much the entirety, in some way, shape, or form, since Juan's death in 1974.
Yes, a lot of people thought it would die with him. It never has. I think partly that's because it has this great capacity to reinvent itself and to keep morphing into something slightly different. The fact that, as I said, it was a fairly ideologically vacuous construct to begin with. It kind of meant whatever Peron said it meant at any given moment. What is more or less non-negotiable is that it is seen as having a social component. It has to have a social welfare component and some concern for working class citizens. I think it's also been successful in that way because it's managed to colonize such a huge amount of the political spectrum. It was never revolutionary in the way that it pretended, but it's sort of taken over a great deal from the center left to the center right. And so it's been able to keep reinventing itself. Carlos Menem in the 1990s embraced neoliberalism and privatized everything. And then after the crisis in 2001, the Kirchners came back with a more leftist form of Peronism and renationalized everything. And it's been sort of a long series of 180-degree turns in a way. As I say, at this point, it's hard to see much about it that is substantive in terms of what you might call Peronist ideology. And it's not anywhere near as big a party as it was, but it's still the largest political movement. There's been nothing to replace it. What is maybe more concerning at this point is that what we're seeing that may replace it isn't a political movement. It's simply a rejection of politics and of the political system altogether. That seems to be the tendency now. Up until now, the Peronist movement has been quite good at containing that sort of trend. I'm not so sure that it can now.
Well, and we've seen Peronism take the form of the Justicialist Party, and the current president, Alberto Fernandez, and Vice President, former President Cristina Kirchner, they're often associated with Peronism. As you mentioned, with the Kirchners, Cristina herself sometimes compared to Eva in certain ways. But we also, as you say, see these moments of pushback. So, before Fernandez, Mauricio Macri was president. There was a recent primary where Javier Milei was the first place finisher. So, what do the prospects, as we sit here in an election year in Argentina, general election, presidential election year? I guess we'll wrap up with what are the prospects for Peronism and the Argentine political system at this crucial moment in so many ways in the history of Argentina?
Well, I think it's the political system that I think is really under pressure at this point. Let's say that regardless of how the election comes out, the economy is in an absolutely disastrous state. It's functioning on continuing disbursements from the IMF to try to keep going from hand to mouth. But whoever becomes president is going to have to implement some very, very unpopular reforms, which is going to be difficult to do. It's going to come up against a lot of social protest. As you say, Javier Milei came first in the party primaries, which was a surprise, but it's still, the results were about 30% of the vote for Milei, about 28% of the vote for the main opposition coalition, and about 27% for the Peronist coalition, which is currently in office. So that's essentially within the margin of error of any opinion poll. It's still, what it's showing you is that the whole system is pretty much divided, maybe not even into thirds, into quarters, because about a third of people abstain from voting at all, even though voting is obligatory. And this is definitely telling you that Peronism doesn't have the ability for containment that it had for a long time. How this holds together in the general elections in October is another question. Will all the people who abstained actually vote for somebody like Milei, who's threatening to blow the whole system up? What I think is concerning is that there's 30% of the voters, at least, that don't care about the system because it doesn't work for them, because they don't see the benefit of staying within it, and they're quite happy to vote for somebody to have it blow up. They don't see it's going to get any worse. I think we've all seen in the past that things can always get worse. And voting kind of against the system in favor of anything else is not necessarily a good option. But, what I can see is that regardless of how the presidential election comes out, the Peronists will still have a very large representation in Congress. Anybody who is president is going to have to negotiate with them, because if they don't, they're not going to get anything through Congress, and the Peronists still have more capacity to bring people out onto the streets than anybody else. So I think going forward, however much they've fallen on hard times, they're still going to be, whether they win or lose, they're still going to be power brokers, and they're still going to be a force that can contain social protest to a degree, or they can channel it. So they can't be just discarded as no longer relevant.
Well, we'll definitely be watching what happens, and I'm sure the topic of the upcoming Argentine election is something that we will be looking at more in the future on this show. So definitely something to keep an eye on. But I want to thank you, Jill, so much for joining me today. Before we conclude, can you maybe take a minute and give a brief overview of your work and anything that you think the listeners who have been enjoying today's conversation would like to look at in regards to what you've done over the years?
Well, thank you. As you said at the beginning, I've published 3 books that are relevant to this area. One is A Modern History of Argentina, which goes kind of beyond Peronism, and then biographies of both Juan and Eva Peron. I work for a political risk consultancy, so clearly one of the things that I focus on is Argentine politics. And as you say, you and also I will be focusing very closely on the Argentine elections and what happens thereafter in the next few months.
Alrighty. Well, a reminder for everyone listening that the show notes page for this episode is placesandprofiles.com/2. So placesandprofiles.com/2, the number 2 there, is the place to go to get more information on Jill's work and some notes and information about this topic that we've been discussing today. And Jill, once again, thank you so much for your time and for joining me on the Places and Profiles podcast to talk about Juan and Eva Peron and Argentina. I greatly appreciate you for taking the time to join me today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.